Oh, hey, CNFers, you know this show takes a lot of time. And part of what makes the lights remain on above or a box fan below because it's so damn hot. Not on now, but you get it. Is if you consider hiring me to take a look at your work. A generous editor helps you see what you can't see. There are so many things I can't see in my own work, which is why I hire out my editing when I can afford it. This could be a pitch, a proposal, an essay, or hell, even a book. If you need help cracking the code, man, you can email me at creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll start a dialogue. Oh, and this episode's also brought to you by the word lacuna. Plural is lacunae. I reached out to the people at Lacuna, and they were stoked. Lacuna, a blank space or a missing part, or a small cavity, pit, or discontinuity in an anatomical structure. Lacuna.
The reader is the one that creates the scenes. I just give them the ingredients for it.
Oh, hey, it's your CNF and spin instructor, Brendan O'Mara, and this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to groovy dudes about telling true stories. Today, for episode 420, we have Rebecca Renner. She's a journalist, a former English teacher, writes a lot for National Geographic, has an MFA in fiction writing, and is the author of Gator Country, Deception, Danger, and Alligators in the Everglades. It's published by Flatiron Books. This book is a masterful 3-threaded braid friendship bracelet about poachers, alligators, the environment, storytelling. I really dug this book. It's been a little while since I read it, and we recorded this episode something like 4 months ago, so I'm finally getting to it. Yay! Since it's summer, kind of felt like a good time to go to the sweltering humidity and heat of the Sunshine State, home of the Stanley Cup champion Florida Panthers, home of hockey. Show notes and the parting shot to this episode will be at brendanomera.com, hey, where you can also sign up for the companion Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Each podcast gets a cute little newsletter since I'm not on social media these days. There's a Too Long Didn't Listen mini transcript, some behind-the-scenes bullshit about my rotten head and my even more rotten writing. And then there's the first of the month Rager with cool links and book recommendations, stuff like that. That literally goes up to 11. And also there's patreon.com/CNFpod. And I want to welcome a new patron, Adina, to the crew. Adina. What a beautiful soul. Adina and I go back 20 years to our diaries, memoirs, and journals class we took together with our friend and mentor, Madeline Blaze. And for whatever reason, she liked the drivel I was writing, and I don't know, we just kind of had a good connection in class. I loved her work, and for some reason she saw something in mine that maybe I didn't even see at the time. She's got the snap, as I like to say. Every couple of years she pops up in my inbox, and it makes me feel all warm inside. I don't know how else to explain it. She's one of the good ones, CNFers. Thanks, Adina. I'm moving the text of the parting shot to the show notes to de-bloat the companion Rager. Been bleeding subscribers, so I need to make some sort of pivot. You know, with a book coming out next year, it's disconcerting seeing so many people get in the lifeboats and paddle for shore. You know, listen, I've been told it's in bad taste to talk about unsubscribes, and I only bring it up because it's on my mind, and I don't know why it's happening to the newsletter and even the show. I'm going to riff a little more about this in the parting shot, so stay tuned, dude. All right, Rebecca. She's undeniably confident. Like, what must that be like to believe in yourself? I truly, truly need therapy to purge that from my system. You know, my inability to believe in myself. I think I know the root cause, but I need to work it out, man. All right, in this episode, Rebecca talks about revision, opening herself up to possibilities, world building. I love world building in nonfiction. Trickster stories, annotating her reading, and making the pig. Good, it's some real good stuff, man. Really good stuff in here. I think you're going to love it. I know I did. So let's riff. And you said a moment ago that you're looking to like get back into the writing swing of things. So what's the nature of that? Like,
Just a little bit of everything. I've been working mostly on fiction, but I need to be doing nonfiction too. And I'm working on submitting an anthology, which is going to be fun. But I haven't gotten that together yet. Gosh, what else? I'm working on like 3 novels and like at least one nonfiction book and trying to write short stories because I had a big magazine request one from me and I went, oh my gosh, I don't have any short stories because I don't really write short stories. And I've been sort of like psychoanalyzing myself to try to figure out why I can write essays of that length, like first person or even like why I can write nonfiction of that length, but I can't seem to write fiction of that length, even though I write very narrative
mm-hmm.
nonfiction. So that's my thing I'm doing today is attempting to write a short story, and I'm doing it by making it mostly nonfiction from the first person, except for created incidents. So
Mm-hmm. I know any time that I have dabbled in fiction, it always ends up coming back to nonfiction because the imaginative stuff, it just doesn't feel it feels too made up, and it always just comes back to nonfiction anyway. It's weird. There's just a divide that I have a hard time crossing.
I sort of have the opposite problem where like I'll write something that is real and nobody will believe me. So I have to write nonfiction because I don't understand the rules people have made up for reality to guide fiction because reality doesn't actually abide by those rules. And so I have this major dissonance where I'm like, I don't like what are these rules you all have made up and not communicated to me or the real world? Like what is going on?
Is it because like not adhering to those kind of rules or not being privy to whatever those rules are? Did you come from writing sort of in a backdoor way, just through just a love of stories that have just been passed down to you?
I don't really know what the back doorway. I don't know what the front doorway is, so I'm not sure
Right.
what door I've used.
Yeah.
Um, I did grow up in a big storytelling culture, and people were like both sides of my family would tell stories like orally, passing down histories and things like that. And so I was very steeped in a culture of oral storytelling before I decided I wanted to write a book. There were several books that inspired me, some books that were very popular in the 90s that I didn't think were good, and I thought I could do better than that as like a 9-year-old or whatever. Um, but there are also books that inspired me because for a positive reason. And I luckily got to speak to this author recently and give him my book. Carl Hyacin wrote Hoot when I was about 12, and he was one of the first people I ever told that I wanted to be a writer when I grew up because he came to my middle school when he was touring for Hoot. And I had really loved Hoot because it was the first book that I read that I saw my own experience in. And I'm not sure if other people see their experiences more in other books, but that was the first time that I felt like. So I was recently at the Key West Literary Seminar when I that was when I met him for the second time in my life, and one of the themes that ended up coming out in everyone's talks was that Florida isn't the place that you think it is, and literature can happen here. And
Hmm.
that was the thing that hit me that I couldn't put into words then as a 12-year-old. The place that I live is important and literature can happen there. And so I started trying to write around then, and I wrote my first novel when I was 15, and it wasn't very good, but it was very good for a 15-year-old.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and yeah, it's well, Gator Country. I kind of came up with a name that I like, the called like Swamp Noir.
Swamp noir. I feel like that's a thing. There's a lot of South Florida noir in fiction, at least.
Is there
Um,
really? Yeah.
the John D. McDonald's of the world. Oh yeah, there's like a big thriller culture down here. And I think that Gator Country does sort of nod to some of that. It's maybe not quite as hard boiled as a lot of that is,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't know, there's no murder necessarily in the main part of the book.
What struck me about the book too was your this incredible capacity for you to recreate events where you feel like a witness, but you clearly weren't. Like with Jeff, I thought that was really masterfully done, because that's really hard to do, to make it feel like you're there when when you're not there, and you got to do it through interviewing.
Well, I had a lot of other information as well. I had recordings and all sorts of photos and game cam pictures, and I had a lot to go through. And I recently talked to a class at the University of Florida for environmental reporting. They essentially asked about the same thing, is how did I do that? And what I told them was that the reader is the one that creates the scenes. I just give them the ingredients for it. So I had to figure out, and I think the writer that I don't know him personally, but I wish I did, who does this the best is David Gran. Takes all of these very evocative details and puts them together in such a way that the reader can build a scene off of them. And I've been wanting to go back and reread The Wager and really study how he did that, because he's the master at that, I think.
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to speak to him a couple times on the show, and if you feel so inclined, you can listen to David Grant on this very podcast, going back to episode 99, where we talk about Killers of the Flower Moon and why every story is a struggle, and episode 366, which delves into The Wager, his latest book. Blockbuster. He is an industrial complex unto himself. The Gran effect. Also, he seems like one of the guys, one of the like famous writers that you want to meet. He's such a cool, grounded, just good dude, and never disappoints in talking to him. Great guy, great writer, amazing writer. What's really always struck me about his work too is how he was always able to build suspense, even though we kind of know the outcome of certain things, not all the time. But I asked him about that, and he was just like, yeah, well, you have to remember, even though that we know how certain things might turn out, the characters central to that story don't. So you have to like put yourself kind of in their headspace and let things play out in that sort of that narrative way that that they're experiencing it, and then as a result, we're pulled along there too through that degree of subjectivity.
Yeah, I definitely did that too. And where I lucked out, where David Gran did not, is that my main character is alive and somebody who I could call up out of the blue and ask him, how did you feel when such and such happened? What color were your shoes in that scene, or whatever detail I needed. So that helped a lot with that. It also helped that Jeff, my main character, is a very forthcoming person and also a big reader. So he understood most of the time why I was asking the in-depth and sometimes ridiculous questions that I was asking.
How were you able to convince Jeff to become the central figure of a book of this nature?
It was difficult at first because he had gone undercover and essentially disappeared from every public place that he had been previously, like off of social media and everything like that. But the biggest thing that I think really helped is that we're very similar, he and I, and we were gradually realizing that. But as I was analyzing him and trying to get a feel for him and who he was doing the same to me. And so we were essentially reaching the same conclusions at the same times. realizing that I think too that we have some of the same standards for feeling like we can trust someone, like if the way someone talks about their dogs
Mm.
is indicative to both of us. The way they talk about animals, because I think that people who love animals and talk about them like not like possessions, but like small beings that they share their lives with, that those people tend to be people you can trust. At least he and I feel like that. And so it was sort of a gradual progression of getting to know each other. I think we both realized that we could trust each other, and that he was willing to give me all the information that I needed, and be open to whatever questions I need to ask. And
Yeah.
now we're
So,
doing an
okay.
event with each other in
Oh, that's
Tampa.
great. Yeah, I saw that. That's yeah, it's pretty wild that you get to share that stage with him. It reminds me of, I remember watching Tracy Kidder give a talk several years ago, and he had run into one of the main characters of his books like in public, and he like came across him. He's like, "Whoa, like what are you doing out here? Like get back in my book. That's where you belong. Get back to my book." And it's just kind of, it made me think of that with you. Like you're gonna have this event with him, and it's just like he's not in your book. He's very much going on with his life as you are.
Yeah, I feel like I felt like that at first when Jeff would call me out of the blue, is because I would be so like within the narrative that I would be in his head and writing him as if he were a fictionalized person, that whenever he would call me, it would be such a strange whiplash to remember that this is a real person. And I think that was very important though, because one of the things that I really hold dear to me in writing nonfiction, especially journalism, is that I have a duty to the people in the story, to portray them accurately and compassionately, and remembering that they have lives that will have to go on after the story comes out. And I think that, especially in writing about Florida, people sometimes forget that and end up portraying whoever's in the story as just a wild character, who only exists in the story, and they forget that their life has to go on, and that there can be repercussions for whatever you write about them.
It's like there has to be a Hippocratic oath of some kind, like to, for certain people, especially for everyday people, like do no harm.
Mhm.
It's the whole thing of like, I don't know. It's just like, powerful people, different standards, but like for everyday people like you and me, it's like, you got to be, very sensitive to that, because you don't want to just totally throw a hand grenade in their lap that they have to wrestle with for decades, if not the rest of their life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been very happy to have all of the characters, most of the characters, come to me and say how thrilled they are about the book, especially the people down in the Everglades, in the Peg Brown half of the book. I I think this might be the Everglades' favorite book, which is kind of feels wild to me, but the the place down in Choklusky, the Smallwood store, which is like tiny part bookstore and mostly sort of exhibit museum kind of thing. They've sold so many books just already.
Hmm.
The owner ordered 12 and they sold out immediately, and so she's ordering like 100 more. And
That's
I'm
amazing.
now really
Yeah.
worried for the event that I'm going to have there, that it's just going to be a madhouse.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those deals where it's a good problem to have in the event that that's a madhouse, because there's as someone who's done book signings before, and you go before like three people, and two of them were like, well, which way to the bathroom, which is kind of a common experience among a lot of writers.
Yeah, luckily none of mine have been like that, but I've put in a lot of work trying to get people to come there. I think my worst one was it would have been kind of quiet, except for my friend from middle school brought his entire high school Florida history class. So that was also packed, and I don't know how many people would have been there without them, but
Oh, that's
I've been
nice.
doing pretty well so far.
Yeah, well, that's good to have people like that in your corner where they can be like, if you don't show up at this, like if you show up here, you'll get an A on your paper. But if you don't, if you don't, and you better
No.
ask Rebecca questions.
No, but that was the quote unquote worst. And I've been having more of a oh gosh, we need to have more chairs kind of issue coming up at the rest of them, which is good.
When you brought up Peg Brown a moment ago, that's one of the braids of the story, and I wonder, just for you, how did you arrive at various structural elements of this book, being like Jeff's thread, the Peg Brown poacher thread, and of which you kind of hover around the fringes of the Peg Brown thread.
Well, I always knew that Jeff's story was going to be the central story, but this side story had never been that cohesive. Like, that's not how I pitched the book. It had been sort of like a bunch of different other side stories. And as I was writing it, for some reason, I had felt like I hadn't gotten enough information and I hadn't actually found the poachers I was supposed to be finding. And I had all of these doubts. And then I had this realization and this realization ended up being sort of the crux of that half of the book, that I had imagined poachers to be the kind of people who I would have been afraid of, and that being around them would have been extremely harrowing. And then I realized that the people I had been looking for, I had already found them, and I had enjoyed the time I spent with them, and they felt like estranged family members, that I had to completely reassess the angle that I was coming to the story with. And I think that made it a better book, because I had fallen into the trap of having preconceived notions when I went out reporting, and luckily I was able to see past them and see that I had done all the reporting that I needed to do, instead of trying to find the story that I thought I was supposed to find.
Yeah, to that point, you realize that poachers, maybe in Peg Brown's day, were far more clued in to, or more respectful of the land. And it wasn't until the areas became, or swamps were drained and developers came in, and more well-heeled people were off put by the wilderness around them, and thus marginalized the people who were just poaching for sustenance. And then suddenly they became more demonized, and that kind of created this extra, I don't know, demonization of those people who, it was part of their, say, their culture or their background. And I think you navigated that really well.
Well, thank you. I I think that it is difficult to be able to write about that, and I'm not sure I've convinced everyone, because I've had some people say, "Oh, you want us to forgive all poachers, and you don't think poaching is bad." I'm like, that's not what I said. I do
Right.
think poaching is bad, but I also think that it plays a convenient scapegoat for conservation when we focus so much on very obvious acts by humans that we sort of let ourselves slide on the things that we ourselves are contributing to, like habitat loss. And that's, at least in the Everglades, one of the biggest problems. One of the biggest problems that the Everglades faces is habitat loss. And to the point that when we accuse poachers of wholly perpetrating the downturn of a species, it seems nonsensical, because it's not possible for the species to have such a downturn without that habitat loss.
Did you have to resist the urge to like go on like a giant set piece on like alligators and so forth, or was that something in that you took out, or did you're like, I'm just not gonna, I'm not gonna touch the a John McPheesian kind of deep dive on the alligator as a species?
Um, I don't know. I feel like I peppered it in there.
Hmm.
I just I feel like maybe some people might think that the book is just an about alligators book, and I've never really been that kind of writer or nonfiction writer. Like, I'm there for the story, and everything else is the setting. And alligators are important, and I think they're interesting, but I don't know. I can't interview them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I think Verlin Klinkenborg several years ago he wrote like some sort of an essay from the point of view of a turtle, and it was just like, well, can't really. Can you do that? Can you actually achieve that? I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah, it sounds like fiction.
Yeah, it does. It really does. Uh, and I like how did you arrive at in knowing that you were going to be an integral part of the story as well, and just weaving in certain elements of yourself into the story.
Well, I did not think that I was going to be an integral part of the story. And it's weird to me when some people think it's a memoir. I'm just a narrator.
Yeah.
And I did that so I could be a little more descriptive in essentially like all the book in Jeff's part and in the sort of other third of the book. And being able to make a clear line with where I'm pulling back out of that perspective and being a very present narrator, because sometimes I would have to say things that Jeff did not know, or that he couldn't have known then, or that like I needed to be a stronger guide in the story, or else I think it would have gotten claustrophobic.
Yeah, and it's balanced really well. And sometimes you might be able, as the writing of the thing, it might end up feeling too, let's say, front loaded with Jeff stuff, and then you're like, oh wait, I got to pull it back to me, or vice versa. So when you were writing the book, did it just kind of come out natural, or do you have to kind of go and massage kind of things to create a certain balance throughout it?
I was writing this during the pandemic, during like the deep heart of the pandemic, and I don't think any of it came easily, because I was, we were all going through turmoil, and I just could not write. And both my editor and my agent were like, just put words on the paper, and they just kept harping on me to do that. And I kept saying, like, once I start, I'm not going to be able to stop, because I overwrite and I'm very verbose. And so I was correct in that I couldn't stop, and I ended up with a lot of junk that did not belong in the story. But I also ended up with a lot of surprising elements that I don't think I would have encountered if I hadn't just sort of let my brain open up and get into that flow state where I finally stopped criticizing myself to the point of paralysis. And I'm very lucky that I had an editor who helped me find those diamonds in the rough, because I don't think it would have been as good of a book without her.
Yeah, maybe expand a little bit about that relationship between you and your editor and how that dynamic helped shape Gator Country.
So in my acknowledgments, I wrote something like that writing a book is always an adventure, or a process of discovery, and that editing a book is that too. Gosh, I feel like I should look it up or something. Um, do I have a second to find that in the back of the book?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and there was one while you're looking for that. There was one passage that I had just highlighted where I don't know if it was the acknowledgments or just in the book itself. I think it was in the narrative, but you write that writing a book is itself an adventure. No matter how much you plan, you must be open to the unexpected, the outlandish, because that is where the story lives. And kind of goes on a little bit from there.
The thing that I said about my editor sort of goes with that. So I'm glad you brought that up. I'll just read the. So I sang her praises, and this is in the acknowledgments on the very last page. This book isn't exactly what I pitched her. It is so much better. Like I did while investigating the story, she put aside her expectations and let herself see the astonishing, even when I didn't. It takes a lot of talent and a lot of hard work, and I thanked her. But I do think that some editors might have been very rigid and really dead set on the exact book that they had been pitched and unable to see that the reality of the story was not the same. And of course, like I had done all my due diligence in researching before I pitched the story, and the the proposal is pretty long, and my editor said it's one of the best proposals that she's ever gotten, and so it really takes some both introspection, and I almost want to say a like a made up word like outrospection, like being able to eh, remove the sunglasses you're wearing and see the world as it really is, to be able to come upon the story in a way that is not exactly how you pitched it, even though you've done all that work. I really do think that the editing stage is where a lot of the art comes in. And I there's an essay that I've gone back to several times, and I used to teach it when I was a teacher. It's called Revisioning the Great Gatsby. And the writer looks at the various stages of editing that famous book. But one of the things that I go back to is how the writer describes revision as a process of seeing the manuscript, the story, in a new way. And so I think we really did that. We had to figure out not what the story was, but what it was supposed to be, and get it to be that best version of itself. And I really think that that's what my editor did. And I've worked with so many editors from being a journalist that I like to say that I really know what good editing looks like. And I think the best editors will make this very small change, like putting a sentence in a different place, and it'll change everything. And it's just that like gentle, subtle, I don't even know what to call it, like gentle, it's gentle and subtle, but it's also like illuminating when you're working with an editor of that caliber. So it's very surprising to me how much of the book is exactly as the draft exactly like it's the draft that I turned in, just whole pages, and then there'll be like little tiny shifts that made it come alive. And then of course there are parts where she was like, this doesn't make any sense and needs punctuation, or like, can you rewrite this part, like to have it sound like all the rest of it or whatever. So it wasn't all perfect, but I think it was definitely a collaborative effort, and I really like working with editors like that.
Yeah, and kind of to what you were saying a while ago when you were just urged to write, just get stuff down on the page, and that's something like it's really important to do that because you're kind of that early draft, that rough draft, or maybe the zero draft, as Roy Peter Clark might call it. It's kind of like terraforming the world or making the map, and there are always going to be gaps in that cartography, and you gotta feel like, okay, here's a dark spot in the map, like how do we fill this in? But sometimes you just don't know that gap is there until you start, and so you're just kind of going through that process, and that it reveals what else you need to do. But unless you have sort of the uh, lack of a better term, the courage to start and right before you're ready, that stuff just has a tendency to always be in the shadows, and you need to write your way through it.
Well, I've actually been reading the God, what is it called? I think it's the Creative Act. The Creative Act by Rick Rubin. And I feel like some people think that book is a little woo woo, but and I did when I first started reading it, but I really like how he talks about uh, being open to the possibilities of the creative act and the potential there, and being able to get into the flow state and stopping yourself from self-criticism and over analyzing, and just getting yourself to open up. I already said this, but getting yourself to open up to the possibilities. And I think that has been one of the most important things to do in my creative process, because I have to remind myself that I have all the things that I need, like it's all there, and that I don't have to keep going out and getting more details, or over report things, which I have a problem doing, or even in fiction that I just have to believe that I have the story and that I have to get it down, and that I'll see the lacunae.
Oh, whoa. Lacunae? What the? I have never heard this word used ever, let alone verbally. And let's dive into this. It is a blank space or a missing part. Lacunae, nice. A small cavity, pit, or discontinuity in an anatomical structure. And you know what? A book is kind of a structure, and it's kind of a body. And if you ask me, it's most certainly alive. So I think both of those definitions apply. Lacunae. That might be the sponsor of this podcast today. Huh.
As I'm rereading it, or as I'm writing it, like I'll be able to navigate the world that I've built better when it's actually starting to be mapped out rather than just being in my head.
Yeah, when you were submitting, let's say, an early draft to your editor, like describe what that feeling is like when you are now putting this thing that you've worked for months and months and months into someone else's hand, and just the headspace of that uncertainty of like, is this any good, or is it going to come back just totally butchered?
I submitted it to her in chunks because I was having so much time like getting things on the page. But I think I have a very different relationship with this kind of thing than I think the average writer who has not been a journalist has. Because as a journalist, you write the thing, you turn it in, and then you move on. And so I immediately go, ah,
Yeah,
not
relief.
thinking about that anymore. And and so it's like I think you're getting at that the normal person would be angsting about it, but my brain was like, I'm on vacation. So it's a great feeling to me. And I think I actually expected the pages to come back much more critically edited. And I wasn't ready for her to be so gentle. And because especially I'm very hard on myself. And I also say that I'm not a very good editor either, because I don't know how to be gentle like that. I don't know, like I'm not magnificent enough to move one sentence and cause like a you know, Paul on the side of the road illumination, like an epiphany in the author. I just, whenever I've tried to edit somebody, I'm like, please don't cry.
And when we were just kind of bantering a little bit back and forth on threads, I had posited how, and what I love about certain books and nonfiction in particular is this element of world building. And I think that kind of that interested you, and you were like kind of like, oh yes, I really want to talk about that. So just take us to the world building element of this book, but also just how you kind of lock into that.
Well, I really like the concept of world building. My writing background actually started, or and my reading background started in fantasy. There are elements of this book that follow a fantasy mold. Like the map in the beginning of the book, I emailed my editor and asking for a map like in a fantasy novel. And I also follow the structure of the hero's journey for Jeff's journey into the wilderness, and that structure allowed me to gradually go into the depths of the Everglades as a place. And I think that I might have difficulty describing this because it is a difficult thing to put on paper, a place that you recognize and understand and don't see as fantastical, in a way that is illuminating to someone who has never been there before, but also people who know it well. And I've been saying that writing for National Geographic has really helped with that, because I think that the thing that I would also, or almost call gosh, I don't want to say a cliche, but something that if I was writing a pretend National Geographic article and like sort of making fun of it, it would be every little thing that the reader doesn't know, you define it in a sentence or in a clause. And so
Mm-hmm.
I learned to take that with me, to be able to uh, define the world where I needed to and step back where I don't. And that, I think part of that is where editing comes in, because there are places where I had written something and I had just genuinely had not realized that somebody would not understand what it was, like a fan boat or an airboat. Both my editor and my agent said, you need to define what this is, because most people are not going to be able to call a picture into their heads with just that word. And I thought that was really funny, because it's just such a regular part of my world that I hadn't even thought of it. But it's things like that. I think I really sort of started with the texture, the and the like this the specific words. I had to learn to name the world, and I had to talk to people like Jeff and other people who live down in the Everglades, and really ask them what everything is and what all the plants are. And I had several expeditions basically where I'm like, I point to something and ask what it is. And that really helps a lot with world building, I think. I also think that in nonfiction, what makes it different is that I can ask people to define their worlds, and I can let them tell the stories that they think are indicative of their world. And so a big part of world building for me wasn't just all the sort of the setting, the window dressing, the, you know, it's not a tree, it's a cypress kind of thing. It's the shape and the cadence of speech and the stories that people tell, and trying to figure out why these stories are important and what they show about this place. Gosh, there was somebody shared a how-to journalism story the other day that I didn't even bother to read, because it was all about leading the person that you're interviewing into answering your questions. And I was just like,
Mm.
that is the complete opposite of what I think a good interview is. I
Oh
really
yeah.
think that the best interviews are conversations, and if you're forcing them to answer your questions, you're probably not getting to the meat of the real story. And unless they're you know, some paid talking head who is there to hawk a product to you or whatever. If they're a regular person, they know what's important, and they know their world better than you do. So the biggest part to me is to be able to listen and figure out the things that are important to the storytellers within the story, and that created the world.
I think another element of the world building too that you accomplish so well is kind of the duality of Jeff's interiority as he's assuming a different identity while trying to maintain his own, and that is in and of itself is extremely challenging and deft on your part. So there's like there is of course that physical world, but there is an interior world too that you were able to accomplish.
I was really worried about that, because I was afraid that people would say it's too literary, and that I was just making stuff up because I can't, that I don't know what he's thinking. But the way that Jeff tells stories, it made that possible. Because when he would be talking, he would be telling me this story, and then he would pause like a narrator of a written story and tell me what he was thinking then. And he didn't always do that. So sometimes I would have to ask him, or I would go back and ask him when I was writing, if I needed some interiority. But that started because that's the way he told the story. And I was still worried about it after I wrote it. So I was very happy to. Well, I wasn't immediately happy to get a call from him, because a couple days after I had sent him the book, his name came up on my caller ID, and I panicked. I really thought he was going to rip me a new one, even though he's never been like that. I think he was irritated with me on the phone once, and it was sort of it more like you've disappointed a like a beloved teacher, that
Uh-huh.
you just feel like it like all the negativeness is like in your heart because you've disappointed this person, not because of what they're saying. He got me on the phone, and like as he's talking, I just have this like sense of dread, and because he's saying, I got your book and I started reading it, and I was like, oh shit. um and then he said, and I couldn't put it down, and I stayed up until 3 a.m. reading this whole book, even though I know what happens.
Oh wow.
Because it happened to me. And I have 3 words for you. And I was like, oh no. And- because like he's the storyteller that he knows how to pause to really have you on the edge of your seat, even if he's torturing you like this. So he said, I had 3 words for you. Wow, wow, wow. And I like fell out of my chair and like had to be resuscitated.
That's
And
incredible.
but
Yeah.
he really liked it, and he really felt that I had captured him, and I was extremely relieved because I had to stick to what was true, but I had let myself be creative, and weave the story as if it was fiction. And I don't know, I was expecting him to not like it or think that I had, I don't know. I don't know. Like the journalists all have maybe we don't all have these doubts, but I had all the doubts that I had not done a good job representing him or whatever, and he really assuaged those. And I think a big part of that is that he is a lover of stories, not just telling them but also reading them. And so he understood that I couldn't portray him as perfect if I wanted the reader to like him. And so he really got that, and I think he really thinks that I captured him well, and he shared the book a lot, and his whole big extended family has bought copies. And apparently there's a book club at the FWC, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, where he worked, and they're reading it, which is a big deal to me because the book is sort of all about being a compassionate conservationist and having empathy with the people who are breaking the law. And I think that if the people who are going to be the ones enforcing the laws are reading that and taking that in, like that could have a big impact on people's lives. So I'm thrilled at how far the book has gotten, and how many people have connected with Jeff's story.
Yeah, there's when you're talking about, the vernacular of say, like, Southern Florida, and you talk about that for you as well, that you kind of lost your accent, your regional accent, over the years. And I grew up in Massachusetts, and I used to have the classic pretty heavy Boston accent. Comes out every now and again, but I kind of ironed it out when I was in college. And anytime I try to reclaim it, it comes across as performative, or like I'm doing an imitation of my former self. And then, so that was something that kind of struck me. There was just one passage where you talk about that, where you kind of long, or kind of miss, your Southern accent at that point.
I think some of it's come back. Every time I'm down in the Everglades, I come back talking like my grandmother, who had a very thick Florida accent, and it's not quite the same as the Southern accent. It's like a cousin of the New Orleans accent, which is, if you know anything about that accent, it's almost like if you married a New York accent, like New York City accent, with a Southern accent. And it's a very specific thing, and it's not necessarily true for every person with a Florida accent. Mine's not quite as New Yorky as that, but it's because there's been so much movement and travel, especially of people who have money, to these big southern cities, that you end up with these accents that are wholly their own. But there are other characters in this book who have very deep, rich Florida accents, like the character, the guy Wayne, who was one of the people caught in Operation Alligator Thief. He has a very, what I think is a wonderful accent, and he sounds like people I'm related to. And he can really weave a yarn of a story with that accent. So he's a great storyteller that I think I tried to capture a little bit of it, but it's hard without having the audio.
I'm working on an essay right now, just sketching out little points about um, the accent of where you grew up. You know, me being kind of in the southeastern Massachusetts, Boston adjacent, and how not necessarily nostalgia, but there's almost an audio landscape that feels more like home than the physical landscape. Because the audio stuff doesn't change. The physical stuff changes all the time. That accent's going to endure probably until the sun blows up. And so I listen or I watch sometimes on TV old episodes of This Old House, and those are New England contractors, and hearing their authentic, true New England Boston accents, it's not put on, it's not performative, it's just how they talk. It's how everyone I grew up with talks, and it puts me there. And I've never felt a longing for my Massachusetts roots in a way that show and just hearing them talk elicits. It's pretty crazy. And so anyway, I'm very sensitive to how the Boston accent is portrayed. It's very easy to butcher, but when you listen, when you go watch This Old House or something, like that is it. And it definitely makes me want to, I don't know, go there again, at least on the ear. And it's kind of weird, but you follow me, right? Yeah, and it's one of those deals where if you try to write it phonetically, it won't come across. It'll come across almost. It could come across as like making fun or something, and so it's almost best that you just have to like imagine it. It just think you speaking in that particular drawl or accent. It's yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of tricky to navigate that on the written page.
Yeah, I never do that, writing it phonetically, especially because so many of these accents sound normal to me. So I would just be writing it regularly.
Yeah.
And I've read so many people trying to write like my accent and it not sounding to me like me.
Right.
But I think the sort of place that's in between these is it's funny because Zora Neale Hurston is from Central Florida, and I read Their Eyes Were Watching God in high school, and I went to my teacher and I said, I am having such trouble with this book. I can't understand a word they're saying, and I don't know what's going on. And my teacher looked me dead in the eyes and said, Rebecca, read it out loud. And this is back when I still had more of a thick accent, and I read it out loud and I went, oh, because it's a very good rendition of the like deep backwoods Central Florida accent. And I felt sort of embarrassed because it was a phonetic portrayal of my own accent and I couldn't understand it. And I think that's a great book now, but I really had trouble with it at first until I realized how to decode it.
And it just as you've got this book under your belt, and it's been great to see it being featured in prominent places, and it just seems to be really glomming on, especially in Florida. And I just wonder for you, just as you're looking to parlay this into other things, maybe like, what your ambitions are and what your goals are, and maybe your relationship to ambition as you go forth with, whatever's coming down the road.
I don't know. I always wanted to be a writer full time when I was younger, and I'm still trying to do that. And I don't have a day job currently, and I'm very determined to not have to have one ever again. So I guess that's my ambition, to remain unemployable. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know. I think I need to be doing more reporting still and keeping my name out there, but I'm also hoping to have the sort of the full brunt of my creative energy be going toward books. So I'm working on a couple nonfiction books. At least one of them is sort of in this vein with like animal true crime. Um, but I'm also working on a lot of fiction too because that was my first passion. But I'm discovering that there are big similarities and big differences with them, and I think I've come so far as a nonfiction writer that I'm realizing that I need to figure out a way to parlay that learning into fiction writing and not act as if they are two very different things, because I think that's been my stumbling block in the past, is acting like fiction and nonfiction are so wholly different that I could be successful in nonfiction and then not get it for fiction. And I think that I'm conquering that brain block, basically. So I'm trying to do both, even though I think my agent might want me to do at least a little bit of a pen name for the fiction. But
Right.
who
Yeah.
knows?
Yeah. You
What?
got to be thinking of branding.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I feel like I harp on all the same subjects on everything. Like I'm writing fantasy, and I love things that like I love a good trickster story, and Gator Country is a story of tricksters. And so I have all of these tropes and myth themes that I love that I don't think I'm going to ever part from in anything that I write. So I think everything goes together, but who knows? I think my quote unquote pen name is just going to be R.A. Renner. So it's just my initials and my last name, sort of like V.E. Schwab has done.
Nice. I figured my full name is Brendan Ryan O'Mara, and I always figure like if I ever had like a fiction wing, my name would be B Ryan O'Mara, and that would be my fiction pen name, and then Brendan O'Mara is my normal one. So
Well, that's cool. Yeah, my middle name is just Anne, so it's not all that interesting.
and I like digging into certain insecurities that we all harbor as creative people and writers in general. And for you, like, where are some hangups that you have that you feel like you have trouble getting over, if anything?
Gosh, I think when I was writing this, I thought I wasn't a very good journalist, and I thought I wasn't doing enough. And
Hmm.
I've gradually realized that I I I do a lot more reporting than most people would in the same situations, and I like that I am a good journalist, and that I do I'm very meticulous with all of that. So I think that's just a sort of internal self editor that I'm learning to turn off. Gosh, I don't
Yeah,
know.
reporting can take on a lot of different, like, there are certain reporters that are like really good at tracking down, documents or FOIA requests and stuff of that nature. And then there are other kind of reporters that is really good interviewers. So there are like so many different spurs and I don't know, kind of like wings, spokes to the wheel of being a decent, being a very good reporter. And some people have more strengths than others. And so it's so multidisciplinary to be a really good reporter.
Yeah, I think my strength is definitely interviewing people.
Yeah.
To the point where I even when I'm not being a reporter, I'll accidentally get people to tell me things that I don't want to know. Like, no, a couple years ago, that there was like that huge blizzard that hit the entire East Coast. I ended up stuck in JFK Airport, and I accidentally got somebody like pretty like mid to high level at the airport tell me that like several planes were frozen shut with people on them, and I was just like, whoa, too much information, you don't need to be telling me that. um and I only feel okay about saying it now because I don't even remember what year that was. But that was the kind of thing that I was like, I could write this for like the New York Times like in an hour if I wanted to, and but I'm not going to. Because that woman would have like lost her job right before Christmas. Gosh, I don't think I've ever been the kind of person to not think highly of my prose, because I think that prose is one of my strong suits. But I also think that I think about it differently than a lot of other people do, because I know, especially some short story writers who say they have to get each sentence right before they can move on to the next. And I'm just like, I need to get all the sentences out before I start trying to put lipstick on that pig.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're like, I can make the pig.
Yeah. You got to make the pig first before you put lipstick on it.
Yep.
But yeah, I think that the reporting thing might be my insecurity, and maybe also just not understanding like what people want in fiction. But that's possibly just all in my head, because if I am good at figuring out what people want in nonfiction, which I'm not sure I can do either, then maybe I can do it for fiction.
Well, going back to you citing Rick Rubin, like he is someone who's very much like, I don't think of the fans. Like, don't think of the fans. Like, make something that is tuned into your taste and make the fans like it because it's important to you, basically, paraphrasing.
I think you have to find a balance with that though, because sometimes so the novel that I'm working on right now, an earlier rendition of it, I was just like, who is this for? Like, it doesn't have any comp titles. And so I wouldn't have been able to sell it. So that's one of those things where that's all well and good for somebody who is extremely established to say, because they could sell anything.
Yeah.
But if you're not, you do sort of have to find the happy medium between doing like the height of creativity and finding a niche where like people actually want it, or else you won't be able to sell it. So
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just how I feel about it.
Yeah, it's like you have to earn that creative leash where, like, Tom Petty doing Wildflowers with Rick Rubin as sort of his wingman throughout that. It's like Tom Petty has established credibility to do whatever he wants, but until you reach that point, then you do have to have, like you said, some balance between, who is this for versus is this for me and only me.
Yeah.
Very nice. Well, Rebecca, I want to be mindful of your time, and it's always kind of fun talking shop and being able to celebrate the work at hand and everything. And as I bring these conversations down for a landing, I always like asking the guests for a recommendation of some kind. That's just anything you're excited about for the listener out there. So, what might you recommend for them?
Oh gosh. I don't know. I've been reading a lot of things lately. I think my favorite book last year was The Wager, but like I feel like everybody's read that. I don't know.
That book is so tight. It is like he
Yeah,
did
it's really
so much
good.
research, and it's a pretty slim book, but it's really it's heavy in dense, but it reads grippingly and it's lean. It's just yeah, it's masterfully done.
Yeah, I hope it wins something, because he did a really good job with that. What else? What else have I been reading? I don't know. I have this weird habit of starting books and just sort of uh, bouncing around between books. So like I'm 3 chapters into like 20 books right now. So I don't know. I don't know what to recommend to you.
And it doesn't have to be a book. I mean, you could be like, there's just brands of socks that I'm just like totally tickled over, and like that counts.
Gosh, I don't know.
But that's all right. If nothing comes to mind, no big deal. Bringing up The Wager, by the way, because a moment earlier in our conversation, you were talking about you kind of wanted to revisit it to study it. When you dive back into a book or a particularly inspiring magazine piece, what does that study look like for you when you're starting to like really dig into its bones?
Well, I think it's different with everything, but I used to be an English teacher, and so I really love annotating things, and I think that when I do that kind of thing, I figure out basically the big shining thing about that book that I want to understand how that writer was able to tackle. And so what I would want to do with The Wager specifically is go back and look at his scenes and the way he uses details to uh, help the reader craft scenes in their head, because like we've said, he wasn't there to be able to report on all of this. So I think the way he chose the most evocative details is the thing that accomplished that. So I want to look for that and see if is it the details that are making these scenes, is it something else? So that's pretty much what I would do. But I don't know. I'm also might just go back and annotate the whole thing.
And when you're annotating, are you like writing things in the margins, or how does that manifest?
Yeah, well, I would probably either do pins and highlighters or just pens. I have a bunch of colored pens and tabs, and sort of make a key of like what each color means,
Hmm.
and then underline or highlight and make notes where I think it's appropriate. It all depends on what I'm doing and what I'm trying to pull out of the story. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's basically like labeling it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm reading, Louisa Thomas is one of my favorite profile writers for the New Yorker, and she's a sports writer primarily. And, she wrote a really good profile on Nikola Jokic, who's a, center for the Denver Nuggets. But anyway, I have a highlighter out and really breaking down like scenes versus exposition and everything. So I'm kind of just highlighting things in her lead was probably about 1,000 words, maybe more. But yeah, it's just like kind of coloring it and be like, and then you can kind of take a helicopter view, especially if you highlight it and be like, okay, there you can see all the scenes laying out. And you're like, okay, that's why that story felt so charged, because it's really animated by that kind of action.
Yeah. Gosh, I'm jealous of somebody getting 1,000 words for a lead.
Oh yeah, I mean, this profile is probably 8,000 words, so I imagine the lead. Yeah, I tend to, in a long feature like that. I think, to me at least, I define the lead until usually that first page break. Yeah, and this one's probably at least a good 1,000 words, if not more. But yeah,
Gosh, I always feel happy when I sneak like a good paragraph lead in.
right. Yeah,
Never get any space.
yeah. Well, you're probably, yeah, if the success of Gator Country is any indication, you might be able to get some more real estate for yourself. So I see that coming for you, Rebecca.
Well, thank you. I hope so. I need to actually start pitching again.
Well, very nice. This was so great for you to carve out some time to do this, talk Gator Country and talk writing and journalism and all that, all the fun stuff. So just thanks so much for hopping on the program, Rebecca. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You ever find that you're like just bad at talking? Like I get short of breath. Is there a way to breathe while you're talking? Hey, anyway, thanks to Rebecca. Awesome. Yes. We recorded this, like I said, 4 months ago. So thanks for your patience, Rebecca. Not sure if you're going to see this or listen to this, but, thanks for the time anyway. Be sure you're subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your pods. You can find it anywhere. This thing right here, all of this, this kingdom, this is my social network, as is the newsletter. And if you have some spare change in your couch cushions, I know you do. There's some quarters in there. Don't use them for parking. Visit patreon.com/CNFpod. Shop around. There's some stuff there that you get beyond the satisfaction of helping help put some dollares into the CNFing coffers. All right, so I teased at the top of the show about audience leakage and what to do about it. I'm not a huge analytics guy. I don't delve into every nook and cranny. I just look at the big things, and it's hard to ignore that. 3 to 5 people are unsubscribe every time I put out a newsletter these days, and I'm not getting any new signups. I know I'm not getting any new ones. It's I'm not out there publishing work and linking back, so it's I'm hard to find unless you actively seek it out. I'm not on social media, so I'm not like sign up for my newsletter and hoping that like one person clicks on it. I'm just not doing that shit. And I've also been watching the podcast numbers in the last couple months just like crater, like 50% overnight. Crazy. I don't say this to complain, but it's a reality that we as like creative people have, looking to build an audience online, and people you hope to entertain and serve on some level. And yeah, you got to confront that at times. And when you see the numbers tank, you need to, I don't know, you need to make halftime adjustments, if you will, change on some level. Or maybe this is just part of the leveling up game, and this is what the real crux I want to get at. Lots of bands, listeners of the show know I'm a Metallica apologist. I'm going to see them twice in the next month or so. Bands will change their sound, their direction, and they'll know on some level that they're going to lose some of the audience that got them to that point. They have the courage to lose a percentage of the old base in order to chart new territory. Maybe find higher ground. Seth Godin just the other day wrote in a blog post that trust is what's in short supply, not attention. We've been thinking, oh my God, there's attention is so short, and there's only so much of it, and how do we peel off some attention from some people? But you get the attention when you earn it. Attention is bombarded constantly, but my hope is to lean into the ones who are still here. Trying to bring a level of value to your life that deepens the trust in the relationship. That's spending an hour with the show every week, maybe perusing the newsletter. That combined will give you the juice for you to see things through. Maybe feel a little less alone. If people unsubscribe or stop listening, as hard as that is, because this show and that newsletter are so deeply personal that it feels like an attack. We have to have the strength to realize that it's okay. It's no longer for them. It's okay. But we'll keep showing up and be there for them if they want to come back. We'll leave the light on for you. I've outgrown a number of podcasts myself over the years. Be that growing as a person or just, and primarily it's my skill as an interviewer means I can't unhear the way certain very prominent people conduct interviews, and even less prominent people, but I can't bear to listen to people who I don't consider astute interviewers. How they conduct interviews is like nails on a chalkboard, the way certain people handle it. And so I too have moved on. But often some of these shows have millions of listeners, so they don't notice when little old me leaves and unsubscribes. But man, when the same thing happens to me, I feel it. I feel it like a failure that I couldn't win you over, and it hurts. I've been doing this podcast for nearly a dozen years, and I've been a professional writer for 20, and it still stings. It never won't, I guess. But when you frame your mind around this idea of enough, you don't get so obsessed with grow, though you still want to, but your obsession doesn't hinge on it. You get more obsessed with building trust and delivering for the people who still get the joke. And if you're listening this far, I suspect you do. So stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do, interview. See ya.